There are a total of 26 legendary weapons in Elden Ring and Nightreign, and all of them are actually really good, because at the very least, they do some really good damage, because the legendary weapons are the highest rarity weapons in the game, and they're always going to end up doing the most damage in their own respective weapon class. But there still are going to be some that are better than others, so for today we are going to rank all of them from worst to best. Anyway, let's just get into the video. Starting off at the bottom, we have the ECLIPSE SHOTEL. Yeah, even Nightreign couldn't really save this weapon. Yes, even though it does get the most damage out of all the curved swords, it's not going to be by much, and the reason being is because it has a status effect, and weapons that do come with a status effect just inherently get less damage as a penalty, which for the most part might be worth it if you have status effects like Bleed or Frost, but for the case of the ECLIPSE SHOTEL, it comes with Death Blight. And Death Blight is the most useless status effect of all time because practically nothing can be procced with it except for NPCs, which you're hardly ever fighting. The weapon skill does add a bit more holy damage, which is okay, makes it be more respectable. It does also get the option of a follow-up attack, but this AoE is like so small, has like a long animation, and it consumes way too much FP for how good it actually is. And when it comes to the passive effect, it pretty much gives you the chance to kill enemies outright, no matter how much HP they have, which is pretty much the exact same thing as having the sudden enemy death passive effect that you can find in the game, which is also just like pretty average. Number 25, the Golden Order Greatsword, which is one of 5 separate legendary greatswords in this game. 3 of them actually getting that split faith scaling. And the Golden Order Greatsword gets the worst damage of those 3, while also having a mid skill and a completely useless passive effect. Because yeah, the passive effect pretty much adds the Law of Regression spell effect to your heavy attack, which dispels all buffs, debuffs, and status effects for you and the enemy. So yes, if you get procced with a status effect, you can just use the heavy attack to remove it. If enemies are buffed, you can go ahead and use a heavy attack to remove the buff. But like these circumstances are so far and few, and the downsides for this heavy attack are just far too great, because there are so many debuffs and status effects that you can apply to an enemy, and then using the heavy attack can just remove them completely. And then like worst of all yet, it removes your own buffs. So if you have things like Golden Vow or an Exalted Flesh, you just use the heavy attack and then they just go away. And this could all be forgiven if they just changed up the skill to be a lot more useful, which they didn't, because Established Order is still very expensive, and the best part about the skill is the projectile attack, and it takes way too long to get to it. It consumes too much FP to get there as well. Like if you have a long enough opening, the entire skill combo can be pretty good. But if they just made this weapon skill just be a stance, if it was just a stance to where you could choose the AoE or the projectile, it would automatically be so much better. Number 24, the Devourer's Scepter, like the usual suspects of weapons that just suck. Not much has really changed when it does come to Nightreign. Now, the Devourer's Scepter is obviously going to be a really good damaging Great Hammer, which Great Hammers are an amazing weapon type. They get very high stance damage. They actually get pretty decent speeds for how much damage they can output. Obviously, unless you're playing with a Raider, because when the Raider is using this weapon, it's going to swing a lot slower. But yeah, unfortunately, the weapon skill still sucks. It consumes like over 30 FP, has a long animation, no hype armor, does like next to no damage, and it's to the point that it's only really killing trash mobs in a small little AoE, which can do good, but for 30 something FP, it's not. But it does give you some health regen. But the health regen is so bad to the point that it's only good if you're hitting like 3 or 4 enemies at once. And that's only going to be a thing when you're using it against trash mobs. And then the passive effect of this weapon gives you health back when killing trash mobs already. So it's like somewhat counterintuitive. And this entire like weapon skill and passive skill combo is just much better with the Blasphemous Blade, where you actually get respectable damage with the skill. It goes a lot further. You actually get some hyper armor, and it consumes less FP. At 23, we're going to talk about the Lion Greatsbow. Now, Greatsbows in this game are not going to be as useful because in the base game, they do serve as very nice sniping options to like pick enemies off at a distance when going through legacy dungeons to make it a lot more smooth and easy of an experience. But in a fast-paced game such as Nightreign, Greatsbows don't really get as much play. But Lion Greatbow is still going to be useful because of its skill and Radahn's Rain. It pretty much is just a better version of Rain of Arrows. And Rain of Arrows is an amazing skill because it can just melt all these larger bosses. And this is definitely true here. With any single person with like a strength-based character comes across like a Lion's Greatsbow, just pick it up and just use it a couple times against these larger bosses to start off the fight, and you're going to be doing a whole chunk of damage. Now, in terms of its passive effect, it does actually change the heavy attack to have like this spread AoE effect, which can hit multiple enemies at once, but it's definitely going to perform better when it comes to like boss damage at closer range. But like who's really using a Greatsbow for like boss damage? I don't think anybody would be unless you have like basically no good weapons at all. Number 22, the Axe of Godrick, which is one of 2 legendary great axes in the game. And great axes are kind of the counterparts to great hammers. They're going to do less stance damage, but they just do more damage outright. And the Axe of Godrick is a pure physical damaging weapon that does have an okay skill. It's pretty decent at crowd control, gets some okay hyper armor. In terms of like boss damage, it's not going to be the most amazing thing at all. You're probably better off just spamming the light attacks or the heavy attack, because yeah, the Axe of Godrick does get a unique heavy attack in this game that shares the exact same animation as the Great Club with this nice downward slam, and it does result in a nice AoE aftershock. And this AoE can do a bit more damage. It makes it do some more stance damage, which all those things are great and fantastic. Now, the unfortunate thing about this weapon is that you're most likely to find it with the Raider. And when you have this weapon with the Raider, for some reason, it doesn't keep that same unique heavy attack. And it gives it the Raider heavy attack, which has an obnoxiously long heavy attack animation, and you're not going to really be benefiting much of that passive effect. So if they did change the heavy attack animation when using the Raider, I would definitely put this at least into the A tier, but as it stands right now, it's going to be a good weapon when you're using it with the characters that are less likely to find it. Okay, now getting into the A tier, all these weapons are perfectly fine, not really much bad I can say about them. And if I do have something bad to say about them, it's because I'm like nitpicking and being overly critical. And the reason why I am going to be overly critical is because I'm making a ranking video. I have to justify the placement of some of these weapons, and that's just how I do it. But yeah, at number 21, we have the Bastard Stars, which is a flail, and flails are just not good. They're pretty much the same thing as hammers, but just worse, because like the best thing about a hammer is its charged heavy attack, and it takes that same charged heavy attack and makes it 3 times slower. So for the most part, you're just subjected to using those light attacks that have such a high stamina cost with the flails too. Now, thankfully for the Bastard Stars, it does have a passive effect that has a chance to leave these like little bit of an AoEs connected to the enemy. And from my testing, it actually makes it do about double damage, and it happens around about like 20 or 25% of the time. So it's not too bad when it comes to the straight up like R1 spamming DPS. It's not going to be the most amazing R1 spamming option, but it can do okay, especially because it can make it do some decent stance damage. And with flails scaling better off dexterity, it can be a decent stance breaking option for those dexterity types of characters, especially when you take into account its weapon skill in a nebula. Does lunge in really far, can hit multiple enemies, the damage and stance damage can be really good, as can the stun lock potential. Like, the skill is easy to use, it performs very well. It is very similar to the Wing of Estelle skill. Now, it's not going to be as good because the Wing of Estelle skill is quicker, does more damage, does more stance damage, even though the fact it's not a gold rarity weapon. Number 20, the Ruin's Greatsword. Now, the Ruin's Greatsword is an amazing weapon, and you might be wondering why it's getting so low on the list. And the reason being is that it's not any different than it is to the base game. It pretty much performs the exact same way. There's like no really cool or broken type of passive effect slapped onto it, because yeah, the passive effect gives it a gravity-based AoE after using the heavy attack, which is exactly the same as what it gets in the base game. And the funny thing is about this heavy attack is that the motion values for the damage and the stance damage are actually lower than all the other Colossal Swords in the game, and it only makes it do more damage when you connect with the gravity AoE follow-up. So if you actually fight those bosses and miss with the gravity AoE, you pretty much have one of the worst heavy attacks out of all the Colossal Swords. But it's still going to be a Colossal Sword, so the moveset's going to be nice. It's obviously going to get amazing damage. This skill is still really good. It can go very far, knock enemies backwards, send them flying, do some decent stance damage, but unfortunately it doesn't really have much else going for it. Number 19, the Bolt of GRANSAX, the lone legendary spear in this game. And spears, I'm probably going to prefer more in Elden Ring compared to Nightreign, because comparatively to other poking attack types of weapons, the spears would actually get some of the worst DPS. In fact, comparing it to a heavy thrusting sword, like the Dragon King's CRAGBLADE, that one just gets more damage and more stance damage while literally having faster movesets. But the benefit of spears is when you have them power stanced, because they have some of the best power stancing combos. But being that this game is very RNG heavy, it's kind of hard to guarantee that you get another good damaging spear to put in your offhand. But the Bolt of GRANSAX obviously gets an amazing skill in Ancient Lightning Spear, which is like one of the best sniping skills in the entire game. It goes incredibly far at very fast speeds, especially when you have it fully charged. Now, it can be easy to use when it comes to picking off enemies at a distance, but when it does come to like boss damage and like melting bosses really quickly, it's not going to really do it that well, which you might want to prioritize more in a game like this one. But on top of actually using this skill fully charged, it does buff the weapon with 40 more lightning damage, which actually can help out the DPS a lot more and make it more in line with some of these other poking attack types of weapons. So it's a great weapon overall, does many good things, but it doesn't have that boss melting potential that some of these other legendary weapons have. At 18, we have the Giant's Red Braid. Now, this is one of the worst weapons in the entirety of the base game because one, it's a whip, which is a dog shit weapon type. These things have terrible movesets, they're slow, they have like some of the worst DPS out of all the weapon types. Their charged heavy attacks do less stance damage than a dagger charged heavy attack, and the trade-off for all of this is that they can't be parried and they have some decent range. And when it comes to the skill of the Giant's Red Braid, in the base game it was just terrible because it has awful damage. You tend to get stuck in a longer animation with like next to no hyper armor. You can like cancel the first and the last part of it, but that entire middle section you're pretty much just a sitting duck unless you are fighting enemies that can be staggered and stun locked. But against any other enemy, especially those larger ones, it just fucking sucks. But in this game, when you use the skill, it summons these bunch of fire pillars. So it pretty much just like adds the burn or flame spell to the weapon itself. And the funny thing is that these flame pillars do like so much more damage than the weapon, it's not even funny. And it makes it be like one of the best weapons that you could potentially use against these larger bosses, especially if they're weak to fire damage. Number 17, the CARIAN Regal Scepter. Now this weapon is very hard to rank because obviously it's a catalyst. And what makes a catalyst good is depending on its spells that it has, which is obviously RNG based. Now this catalyst is guaranteed to come with Renala's Full Moon, which is an amazing spell, does incredible damage, it does debuff enemies to make them take more damage, so you can just always use this to start off a boss fight. Now when it does come to the passive effect, it pretty much just gives it CARIAN retaliation every single time that you use a spell. Like you can just transform some spell-based projectiles into your own projectile, which is like kind of shit for the most part. And the fact that Renala's Full Moon is not even specific to this catalyst and that you can get it with other catalysts too, it makes this thing very hard to rank. So I'm just going to put this thing at the top of the A tier. Okay, getting into the S tier, which yes, a majority of the legendary weapons are going to fall into the S tier because yeah, most of these are just incredible across the board, or they just have one thing going for them that just makes it broken. Which at number 16, we're going to talk about the Grafted Dragon, which is a fist-based weapon that cannot be two-handed. You're forced to just have it one-handed the entire time. You can have like another fist weapon or your bare fist in your offhand to power stance if you wanted to, if you really wanted to try and maximize your DPS. But the way to actually use this weapon is just by spamming charged heavy attacks, because one-handed fist charged heavy attacks do 30 stance damage, and it comes out in such a quick animation that this attack alone can be one of the best stance breaking attacks in the entire game. Now obviously stance breaking quickly is going to be a great benefit, but it might not be that good of a reward if you don't have a good critical hit weapon to follow up. But the Grafted Dragon does get a passive effect that makes your critical hits do more damage because it spews out a whole bunch more fire on top of that can hit surrounding enemies too. And it can be some of the most critical attack damage in the entire game, and the fact that it is on a weapon that can stance break so quickly, it just synergizes perfectly. And on top of that, it actually gets a skill that can hit very hard as well. Now the downside of this skill is that it is pretty short range, you don't really get much hyper armor, so you can get staggered out of it. And you know, fist weapons themselves just have pretty poor range too, so it might not be the easiest thing to use in the world, but the damage is undeniable. Number 15, the MARIKA'S hammer. My favorite weapon in the base game, where it's an S tier over there, and it's an S tier here as well. Because yes, it's a high damaging hammer, which hammers, as I've talked about, not going to be the best weapon class, but they do have very good charged heavy attacks that come out fast and can do some high stance damage. And specifically for the MARIKA'S hammer, it does get an AoE shockwave follow-up. Now this holy AoE doesn't really get much damage. In fact, it gets less damage than a light attack, but the fact that you can do bonus damage and bonus stance damage on the best attack that a hammer can get is obviously going to be a great benefit. And yeah, the MARIKA'S hammer still retains that really good skill in Goldbreaker. It gets that infinite hyper armor, it can send these smaller trash mobs flying in the air in this massive AoE, and at point blank range, it can do incredible stance damage too. Number 14, the Sword of Night and Flame. Now this is a very unique and interesting weapon for multiple reasons. The main one being is that it does get scalings in 4 different stats. And in a game like this, we have some characters only getting good scalings in like 1 or 2 damaging stats. This weapon doesn't really reach its full potential. Like if you're playing the Raider or the Executor, the Sword of Night and Flame doesn't really get that much more damage than anything else. But when you do play characters like the Wilder or the Duchess, and especially the Recluse, which having another melee option for the Recluse is always a good thing. Yeah, for these characters, it performs really well. And the Sword of Night and Flame does get amazing skills that gives you the option of a magic or a fire-based attack. And being that this is Nightreign, all these skills actually scale off AR. So therefore, they're all going to be scaling better off strength and dexterity compared to intelligence or faith. But the magic one is going to be the better one for damage and actually stance damage too if you use it at point blank range. Whereas the fire one is going to be better if obviously you're fighting those enemies weaker to fire damage, or if you do want something for crowd control and better hit detection. And the passive effect for this weapon do have them get buffed with plus 40 more elemental damage depending on which skill that you use. So it can actually help mitigate one of the weaknesses for this weapon, which is that pretty poor damage for some characters. But it is reliant on using the skills first, which they can be pretty expensive. So for some characters where you don't have much FP, it might not be the best weapon to use. Number 13, the Blasphemous Blade. The best weapon in the entirety of Elden Ring is not even in the top 10 for this game. And the main reason being is that it doesn't actually have anything going for it in this game that makes it different or better than the base game variant. Because yeah, a lot of these legendary weapons have these like added benefits that can just make them so much better, if not broken. But yeah, the Blasphemous Blade is still like one of the hardest hitting greatswords in the game. It's still going to give you health regen on kills. It still has an amazing skill that goes really far, does good damage, can heal you on hits, give you a bit of hyper armor as well. Like, it's nice, but for the characters where it's most likely going to be useful, which would be the strength-based characters, they don't really have much FP to where they can just continuously benefit off this like broken skill. And the skill itself is great for like survivability, but it's not going to be the best thing when it does come to boss damage. So it's an overall solid weapon, but part of the reason why it was broken in Elden Ring is because of all the buffs that you could actually have alongside with it, which are either just non-existent in this game or just very hard to come by. Number 12, the Hand of Malenia, which is going to be the hardest hitting katana in the game, which katanas are probably the best dexterity weapon type that you can get, being that power stancing is pretty scarce, and that bleed is still an amazing status effect to have. And when it does come to waterfall dance, this is an extremely efficient skill, which is very beneficial in a game like this. Now, it's definitely going to perform a lot better against enemies that can be staggered and stun locked, or enemies that give you longer openings, because yeah, unfortunately, you're not going to really be able to trade out with a skill like this due to the lack of hyper armor. If this thing just had infinite hyper armor like the other airborne skills in this game, it would be so much better. I'd easily put this thing close to the top 5 because it actually comes with the passive effect of that partial HP restoration or that rally mechanic, and that you can convert that taken damage back into health. And with a skill like Waterfall Dance, if you were to tank attacks and trade out, you could essentially just get all that health back while just doing damage for very little FP cost. So it's still going to be amazing. Like, that passive effect is going to come into play even if you do have it in your offhand. It's still going to be a hard hitting katana. It's just not going to be that perfect weapon. At number 11, we have the Axe of Godfrey, which is a colossal weapon. And the Axe of Godfrey in the base game wasn't really that good, and part of the reason was because of its damage. It had a pretty poor strength scaling, and it was to the point that a lot of other colossal weapons could just outdamage it. But being that in this game it's a legendary, it is actually going to get the most damage in class, especially after using the skill and the passive effect. Because the skill does give you a buff, which does give you a bit more strength, which is like inherently more damage to your weapon, and it does change up the animation of your heavy attack. And upon using a charged heavy attack, whether this thing is buffed or not, it is going to give you a 20% damage boost for 15 seconds, which is just ridiculous. And it can make this thing like the hardest hitting weapon in the game when you do have these couple of buffs active. Now, the downside for this weapon is that it's most likely to drop with the Raider. And the Raider just gets a pretty slow moveset when using colossal weapons, especially with those charged heavy attacks. But as I mentioned, when you use the skill for this weapon, it does actually change up the heavy attack animation. Now, the downside of this heavy attack is that the stance damage just sucks. Like, the entire heavy attack combo does less stance damage than a straight sword heavy attack combo. So the way I would actually like to use a weapon like this would be using the skill, use one charged heavy attack, and then just like keep spamming light attacks, or if you're power stancing, maybe spamming jumping attacks instead. And that way you can just like keep outputting amazing damage. Number 10, the Morgott's Cursed Sword, which this weapon is a curved greatsword, which they do get pretty decent movesets. Their uncharged heavy attacks are actually faster than light attacks. So what you can do is go uncharged heavy attack into the light attack combo, and it could just do more damage than you otherwise normally would. The Morgott's Cursed Sword also gets the most range in class by a considerable margin, and it does get an amazing skill in Cursed Blood Slice. It lunges in really far, good stun lock potential, good bleed build up, because yeah, this weapon actually gets a C scaling in Arcane, which is actually better than what it had in the base game. Now, the downside of the skill is that it does consume a lot of FP. Like, the entire combo is 40 FP, and with how quick you can spam it over and over again, you're definitely going to run out of FP really quickly. But there is another way to actually play around this weapon, and that is going to be with its charged heavy attacks. Because yeah, charged heavy attacks can stance break quickly, and the benefit of that is that you can get a critical hit. And with this weapon and its passive effect, it gives it boosted damage to the critical hit that results in this like little short range blood flame AoE. And this critical attack is just busted. Like, it's the highest damaging critical attack in the entire game, beats out every single dagger. It even beats out the Axe of Godfrey when it comes to a critical attack, even though it's just a curved greatsword. Like, it just does amazing damage. Like, the only reason why I'm not going to put this thing higher is because in multiplayer, it's kind of harder to proc a stance break, and you're not always guaranteed to be the one to get the critical attack too. But in solo play, you can argue this thing being top 5. Number 9, the Winged Greathorn, which is the other of the 2 legendary Great Axes. Both this and the Axe of Godrick get the exact same damage. Similar range, both physical damage as well. But what makes the Winged Greathorn so good is going to be because of its skill and its passive effect, because both of them actually apply debuffs. The skill and Soul Stifler for only like 12 FP leaves this AoE cloud. When enemies walk inside of it, they take about 15% more damage. And in terms of the passive effect, every single time you land an attack, it actually has a chance of proccing another debuff. And for my testing, it's about like a 1 in 3 or like a 1 in 4 chance of leaving a debuff every single time that you hit an enemy. Now, this debuff that you get by landing an attack isn't going to last as long, and it is only going to be a 10% debuff. But the thing is, both debuffs actually stack together. So you can use the skill, use a light attack a couple times, and then like switch to another weapon if you wanted to, that could potentially do more damage, and then fight a boss that's just going to take over 25% more damage. And the good things about debuffs is that, one, they're not going to interfere with your own buffs, and obviously all your teammates can benefit too. Number 8, the MALIKETH'S Black Blade, which is a colossal sword, does get somewhat of a faith-based scaling. Obviously, really good damage. Colossal swords have a great moveset as well. Now, for the MALIKETH'S Black Blade specifically, it does get a skill in Destined Death that does hit very hard, especially against larger bosses with lots of HP, because the Destined Death leaves a damage of a time effect that is percentage based. So obviously, the more health an enemy has, the more damage they'll take by this. Now, unfortunately for the skill, it does have somewhat of a longer animation. It is close range, and you can get staggered out of it as well. And it also consumes over 40 FP. So you're only really going to be using this like 2 or 3 times max with these like strength-based characters. But the reason why it's going to get into the top 10 is because of its passive or its unique effect that pretty much leaves a Destined Death effect for every single attack. Even for a light attack, you just hit something one time, it's going to do over 1% damage guaranteed on top of the damage you're already doing. So against these bosses with lots of HP, especially in multiplayer, there's not going to be many weapons in the game that are going to be hitting as hard as the MALIKETH'S. Number 7, the Dragon King's CRAGBLADE, which this is a heavy thrusting sword with some split lightning damage. And as I mentioned with the heavy thrusting swords, these are an amazing poking attack type of weapon. They offer some of the best two-handed movesets in the entire game with those really quick pokes and that amazing running heavy attack. The only thing they might end up lacking would be like variation of movesets or a stance damage potential. But for the Dragon King's CRAGBLADE, it pretty much negates that entire stance damage deficit because both the skill and the jumping heavy attack via its passive are just insane. Because yes, if you don't know, the Dragon King's CRAGBLADE skill is currently running on the pre-nerf version. So it is doing that amazing stance damage that it once did. And it's to the point that it's like stance breaking these larger bosses in just 2 hits. Now, some of the downsides of this particular skill is that 1, it doesn't actually work with the multi-hit talismans nor Godfrey's icon, but being that those are pretty hard to come by in this game anyway, that's not even going to be that much of a downside. And 2, it can be very hard to aim and track, so against certain types of enemies, you can just completely whiff. But this attack does give you infinite hyper armor, and you still take damage, but that's actually not going to be much of a downside if you have this paired alongside the partial HP restoration relic, because any single time you're getting hit with this, you're basically doing damage at the same time, and you can just get all that health back while doing amazing damage and stance damage on top of that. And even against those enemies that are pretty hard to hit with a skill, or if you run out of FP, you can just use the jumping heavy attack. Because yeah, the jumping heavy attacks also have you transform into a cloud that make you do bonus damage and a lot more stance damage. Like a jumping heavy attack with this weapon will do more stance damage than a jumping heavy attack for a colossal weapon. Number 6, the Dark Moon Greatsword, still one of the best weapons in the entire game. Still a hard-hitting greatsword. It's not going to get as much as all of the other legendary greatswords, and that is because it does come with a passive status effect in Frost. Now this is definitely worth it because Frost is a broken status effect. It does a chunk percentage of damage to enemies and bosses, and it does debuff them to make them take a bunch more damage on top of that. And the funny thing is with a Darkwing Greatsword, it has a passive or special effect that lets you debuff enemies with every single attack. Like not just a chance of proccing, every single time that you hit something, it debuffs them to make them take 10% more damage. So the entire downside of it getting less damage is just completely mitigated, especially when you take into account its skill in Moonlight Greatsword that just buffs it with more magic damage and more frost to proc it even faster, and give you free projectile heavy attacks, which in a game like this, where you're playing with these strength-based characters with a greatsword and the FP might be pretty hard to come by, having a free projectile heavy attack that can do amazing damage and be very efficient, it is just amazing. Number 5, we have the Sacred Relic Sword, which is yet again another legendary greatsword. This one is going to get the most range in class, going to get that split faith scaling, and it does get an amazing skill that's probably the best at crowd control because it can just clear out an entire room or an entire camp full of enemies in just one attack. Even against like some slightly larger enemies, it can like knock them back and send them flying to the ground. Now the obvious downsides for this skill is that it does consume a lot of FP, like it's over 40 FP every single time, and it's not going to be the best when it does come to boss damage. Like you're not really going to be melting bosses quickly with a skill like this. But that is where the heavy attack comes into play, because the charged heavy attack with its passive effect gives it a projectile, and this projectile travels really fast, it goes really far, and obviously it's not going to consume any FP. And actually at point blank range, this thing is just broken. Like the damage is absurd and the stance damage is ridiculous. Like this charged heavy attack at point blank range, because you're hitting with both the hitbox and the projectile at the same time, you're doing like more stance damage than a giant crusher heavy attack. And it's obviously going to be in a faster animation. And one thing as well to note is that the Sacred Relic Sword actually gets the highest crit damage out of all the great swords. So when you stance break quickly, you're going to benefit of the hardest hitting critical attack too. Number 4, the MOHGWYN'S Sacred Spear. Now, all the reasons that make it amazing in the base game is still true here. It is a great spear, so it gets some decent stun lock potential. It does get the most range out of all the great spears. But when it does come to the skill of the MOHGWYN'S Sacred Spear, this thing just destroys everything. Like anything even sitting remotely close to you is pretty much going to get deleted. They'll get stun locked, get hit by monstrous amounts of damage, get procced with a bleed really quickly. And even if you don't have an opening long enough to use the entire combo, you're still going to benefit from a buff. Because yeah, like the skill does buff your weapon with some more fire damage. But what makes it even better now in this game is that From Software decided to give a passive effect that grants bonus damage when proccing bleed. Just like the Lord of Blood Exaltation that gives you like a 20% damage boost for 20 seconds, the exact same thing, except it's 30% more damage, which is just silly. Number 3, we have the STARSCOURGE Greatsword. Now this weapon is actually pretty decent in the base game. It's a paired colossal sword, so therefore when you two-hand it, you gain the power stancing combo, which is going to get some decent DPS. Unfortunately for the stance damage, it's kind of mid, because your power stancing light attack does less stance damage than if you just had it one-handed and use a light attack. Don't know why that was the case, but for Nightreign, there is a passive effect that lets your first light attack also have this massive gravity AoE, which I don't know why they did that, but this shit is just broken. Because it pretty much like doubles your damage and doubles your stance damage while letting you attack in a massive AoE. So even if you slightly miss with the weapon, you're still going to do damage to the AoE. You can hit groups of enemies with just one light attack. You're still going to get amazing DPS because you're going to be power stancing while only having the one weapon. So therefore you can put a weapon in your offhand and still benefit off the passive effect there. And you can just go ahead and keep spamming the first light attack all the time, but it's constantly block canceling. And even if you wanted to have a larger AoE, you have the skill, because the skill does a larger AoE gravity attack with a follow-up attack that can do like even more damage. Like the skill is actually fantastic. It might consume a little bit too much FP, and honestly there's not even much of a point of using it because you can just spam light attack the entire time. Okay, getting into the broken tier, because yeah, we have to have a special broken tier for things like the MARIKA'S Executioner Sword and the Grafted Blade Greatsword. I don't care which one you put at number 1 or number 2, they're both fucking broken. Because in the case for both weapons, they have this passive effect that when you get a kill, it gives you a permanent buff unless you die. And for the case of the MARIKA'S Executioner Sword, it does give you like a 0.8% damage boost for every single kill, but being that it's like a permanent buff, you can go ahead and kill like 100 enemies and then gain like double damage. And this is going to be to all your sources, it's not just going to be to that one weapon. And it's not like the weapon itself sucks, like it's still going to be a good weapon. It has a very hard hitting skill, which might rely a bit on things like the multi-hit talismans and the Godfrey's icon, but it doesn't really matter much when you can actually literally gain double damage by just killing enough enemies. And this skill is actually going to be very efficient too, only consuming 15 FP, which is great for this game. And in the case of the Grafted Blade Greatsword, every single time that you get a kill, it gives you like a small chunk to like every single stat. So you go ahead and kill a bunch of enemies, and you're pretty much going to be unkillable while doing amazing damage and having lots of FP. And same thing kind of still applies. It's not like the weapon itself sucks. It's a colossal sword that gets amazing damage, and it has a skill that lets you just gain even more stats temporarily, and while giving you the endure-based skill as well that lets you tank so much more damage. Okay, that is us now done and completed with that one. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. And please definitely do like and subscribe because I'm making videos like this all the time, and they definitely do take a lot of effort. So if you do like what you see, definitely show some love. And I'll catch you guys around. See yous.